They say one moment can change everything. For billionaire Edward Monroe, it began with laughter behind a half-closed door. He came home early, something he never did. He walked through the quiet corridor, then stopped. Soft voices drifted from a room ahead. He opened the door and froze. There on the floor, his daughter was laughing, learning, and beside her sat Naomi, the family maid, teaching with patience and warmth no tutor ever could. For the first time, his perfect world felt shaken. He thought she was just the help. He had no idea. This woman was about to teach him far more than numbers. It had started like any other morning. Edward Monroe was a man who liked order, a man who believed in control. He ran a chain of tech firms that sold educational software to elite schools across the country. He donated to universities, sat on boards, gave speeches about innovation in learning. But at home, he couldn't fix the one thing that mattered most: his daughter's struggle to learn. Emma was bright, but numbers frightened her. Every expert he hired made things worse. He'd spent more money than most people earned in a year on therapy and private tutors. None of it worked, and now, a maid had somehow reached her in 10 minutes. It made no sense. That night he couldn't sleep. He poured a glass of whiskey and walked through the dark house. Everywhere he looked, he saw traces of Naomi's quiet touch: polished tables, folded blankets, a soft order that felt human. But that scene in the living room replayed again and again. The way she guided Emma, the patience in her voice, the confidence in her hands. No ordinary maid, he thought. By morning, curiosity had turned to irritation. "Jennifer," he told his assistant over the phone, "I need you to run a background check on our new housekeeper. Naomi Carter. Get me everything." "Everything, sir." "Yes, education, employment, anything before she started here." Jennifer hesitated. "Is there a problem?" "Just do it." He ended the call before she could ask more. Later that day, Naomi moved quietly through the halls, dusting shelves and humming an old gospel tune. Edward watched from his office doorway. She didn't flinch under his gaze. If anything, she seemed at peace, as though she carried some quiet truth he would never understand. When Emma came home from school, she ran straight to Naomi. "Can we do the color blocks again?" Edward stepped in before Naomi could answer. "Emma, Naomi has other duties." "You have tutoring with Dr. Harper this evening," Emma groaned. "But he just makes me feel dumb." Edward's jaw tightened. "Enough." Naomi bent down to Emma's level, her voice kind. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'll still be here when you're done." The little girl nodded, half smiling. Edward turned away, unsettled. That night, Jennifer called back. "Sir, about Naomi Carter," she said. "Her records, strange. She's worked for 2 families the past few years. Excellent references. But before that, nothing. No employment, no address, no college records. It's like she just appeared out of nowhere 5 years ago." Edward frowned. "That's impossible. I checked twice. She listed high school in Baltimore, but no higher education. For someone her age, that's unusual." He leaned back in his chair. "Thank you, Jennifer." When the call ended, he sat in silence. Who was this woman? And why did it feel like she was hiding something far bigger than a cleaning job? Outside, the night pressed against the windows. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of Emma's laughter drifted down the hall. Bright, free, alive. And Edward Monroe, a man who thought he understood the world, realized for the first time that he didn't have all the answers. Not even close. He had no idea how much this one woman was about to change everything. It had been 3 days since Edward caught Naomi teaching his daughter, and he still couldn't shake the image from his mind. He told himself it was just curiosity. Nothing more. But deep down, it felt like something else. Something heavier. He couldn't explain why the thought of his maid being more than she appeared unsettled him so much. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was fear. That Thursday morning, The sky over Lakeview Hills was cloudless and cold. Edward skipped his usual breakfast meeting and came home early again. He found Naomi in the study, the same room where everything had started. This time, she wasn't teaching Emma, she was polishing the desk, quietly humming that same soft tune. "Naomi," he said. She turned, her face calm as ever. "Yes, Mr. Monroe. I've been thinking about the other day." She waited, neither defensive nor apologetic. "You seem to know a lot about teaching," he said finally. "Where did you learn those methods?" She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. Then she said lightly, "There are plenty of videos online these days, sir. You'd be surprised what you can learn." He smiled, not kindly. "You expect me to believe that?" Naomi didn't answer. She just looked at him, eyes steady, expression unreadable. Something about her silence made him uneasy. "You organize those materials," he continued, "the way professionals do. Color-coded, progressive, almost textbook level. That's not something you learn off YouTube." Naomi's lips curved slightly, the hint of a smile that wasn't quite amusement. "Maybe I just care enough to do it right." Edward didn't know why, but that answer bothered him more than any lie could have. He left the room before she could see how much it got under his skin. That night, over dinner, Emma asked, "Daddy, why can't Miss Naomi help me with my math again?" Edward sighed. "Because she has other things to do, sweetheart. That's not her job." "But she makes me like numbers," Emma said softly. "Dr. Harper just makes me feel small." Edward's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He didn't know how to respond. So he changed the subject. By the next morning, the curiosity had become an obsession. He called his old friend, Alan Pierce, head of a private investigations firm. "Alan," he said quietly, "I need a background check on someone." Alan chuckled. "A competitor?" "No, my housekeeper." That made Alan laugh louder. "You've really lost it, Ed. What are you afraid of? That she's stealing silverware?" Edward didn't laugh. "Just find out where she came from. And be discreet." Alan's tone changed. "All right, I'll call you in a few days." Naomi, of course, noticed everything. She saw the new cameras installed around the house, the way Edward's footsteps appeared at strange hours, the suspicious pauses in the hallway. She'd seen men like him before, powerful men who needed to be in control, men who didn't know what to do when they met someone they couldn't categorize. Still, she went about her work quietly, moving through the Monroe house like a whisper of calm. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves in the study, Naomi paused at a book, The Language of Learning. She opened it and smiled faintly. Old habits. She had once written an entire paper on this text, back when she was still Dr. Naomi Carter, lecturer and researcher in educational psychology. But that name was gone now, buried for reasons Edward Monroe couldn't begin to imagine. When Alan finally called back, Edward was in his office overlooking the city skyline. "Ed," Alan said, "this one's weird." "What do you mean?" "Your maid, Naomi Carter, has spotless references. She's worked for two wealthy families, both speak highly of her. But before 2020, she doesn't exist. No tax records, no job history, no driver's license, nothing. It's like someone hit a reset button." Edward frowned. "You're sure?" "Absolutely. The name might be new. Maybe she changed it legally. Why would someone do that? Witness protection, divorce, abuse, or maybe—" Alan hesitated. "Maybe she's hiding from someone." Edward felt a strange chill crawl up his neck. "Keep digging," Alan sighed. "You realize you're talking about breaking privacy laws, right?" "I'll cover whatever it costs." "Edward," Alan said carefully, "you're sounding like a man who's about to do something he'll regret." But Edward didn't answer. The next evening, Edward came home just as Naomi was finishing the day's chores. He watched her from the doorway again, this time with something almost like respect? No, it wasn't respect. It was confusion. He stepped into the room. "Naomi, do you read much?" She looked up from folding towels. "When I can, yes." "What kind of books?" Her gaze drifted to the bookshelf behind him. "The kind that make people think." He picked a book from the shelf. "Teaching to Transform." "Ever heard of this?" Naomi smiled faintly. "Of course. It's a brilliant work. Talks about how real education starts when people see each other as equals." Her words hung in the air. Edward's fingers tightened around the book. "You talk like someone who studied this." "Maybe I have." "Where?" She didn't blink. "Nowhere you'd know, sir." Then she turned back to her work, leaving him standing there, pulse racing. That night, Edward couldn't sleep again. He walked to his office, turned on his laptop, and searched her name online. Naomi Carter. Dozens of unrelated results. Nothing that matched her age or face. He scrolled for hours, until finally he stopped on a photograph. A woman who looked like her, but not exactly. The same calm eyes. The same quiet poise. She stood behind a podium at a university conference. The caption read, "Dr. Naomi Clark, keynote speaker on educational equity." Clark, not Carter. His pulse quickened. He enlarged the image. It couldn't be, could it? He checked the year, 2018, and just like that, everything clicked into place. He leaned back in his chair, heart thudding. If Naomi Carter and Dr. Naomi Clark were the same person, then the woman cleaning his kitchen floors was once a world-class educator. But why was she hiding? And what did she want from him? Edward stared at the screen until the image blurred. He thought he had hired a maid. But it seemed he had invited a mystery into his home. A mystery that was about to turn his entire world upside down. For the next 2 days, Edward couldn't focus on anything. Not his meetings, not his investors, not even his reflection. Every time he tried to work, that photo burned behind his eyes, Naomi standing at a podium, confident and brilliant, speaking to scholars who clearly respected her. He'd replayed their conversations 100 times now. Every calm answer, every unshakable glance, it was all there. The poise, the discipline, the quiet authority of a woman who had led rooms full of people before. Not a maid, a teacher, maybe even something more. On Friday afternoon, he called Alan again. "Find me everything on Naomi Clark," Edward said. "Education, history, whatever you can," Alan sighed. "You realize this is starting to sound like stalking?" "Just do it," Edward snapped. When Alan finally called back that night, his tone had changed. "Ed," he said, "you're not going to like this." "I already don't." Naomi Clark, former professor at Georgetown University, Ph.D. in Child Development, published research on inclusive education, won awards. Then, something happened in 2019. She resigned, suddenly. Papers say she went silent after that. What happened? There's no public record, but I dug deeper. She gave a lecture criticizing how wealthy donors influence educational policy. Some of those donors— "Let me guess," Edward said, his throat dry. "People like me." Alan paused. "Yeah, you're actually listed among her critics at the time. Your foundation was one of the top funders of the very program she accused of discrimination." Edward sat in stunned silence. "Whatever went down back then," Alan continued, "it must have been bad. She changed her name, moved across the country, vanished from academia. No trace until she popped up as a domestic worker 2 years later." Edward leaned back in his chair, staring at the city lights beyond his window. "So she knows who I am," he said quietly. "Probably. And she's in my house. That's one way to put it." The next morning, Edward came downstairs to find Naomi making pancakes with Emma. The smell of vanilla and butter filled the kitchen. The sunlight painted everything gold. For a second, it almost looked like a family scene. Soft laughter, warmth, peace. Then he remembered the dossier on his desk. He cleared his throat. Naomi, I'd like to speak with you in my study. Her eyes met his, calm, unreadable. Of course, Mr. Monroe. She followed him in silence. When he closed the door behind them, she stood waiting, hands folded neatly in front of her. Who are you, really? He asked. I'm Naomi Carter, she said simply. Stop it, he snapped. I know that's not your real name. Her expression didn't change. What do you think my real name is? He tossed a printed photo onto the desk, the one from the conference. Naomi Clark, Professor, Georgetown. Does that sound familiar? For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not panic, but sorrow. So you've been investigating me. You lied to me, he said. You came into my home under a false name. I didn't lie, she replied evenly. You never asked who I used to be. Edward laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. You expect me to believe you just decided to become a maid after running one of the most respected education programs in the country. Naomi stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. Sometimes the truth has a cost. Speaking mine cost me everything, he frowned. You're saying you hid because of what? Some academic argument? Her gaze hardened. Because people like you made sure no one would ever hire me again. You funded the very institutions I exposed for locking out poor and black children. I became a threat. Not because I lied, but because I told the truth. Edward's stomach twisted. You think this is revenge, then? Is that why you came here? To humiliate me? Naomi shook her head. No, Mr. Monroe, I came here to survive. You just happened to be the one who hired me. The silence that followed was heavy, electric. Finally, she turned to leave. If you want me gone, I'll collect my things. He said nothing. Just watched her walk out. Steady, proud, unbroken. That evening, Edward sat in the dark study, the house eerily silent. Every word she'd said gnawed at him. He poured another glass of whiskey and stared at the family photos on the wall. His wife's smile, his daughter's laughter, all the things he claimed to value most. And yet, here he was, a man who had spent millions supporting education, while quietly helping crush voices like hers. He thought of Emma, of how her face had lit up when Naomi taught her, and for the first time, he felt ashamed. The next morning, the doorbell rang. It was Alan again, holding a brown folder. You might want to sit for this. Edward flipped through the documents. Newspaper articles, academic citations, award photos. Naomi Clark wasn't just a teacher. She was a pioneer, one of the most respected voices in modern education reform. Her research had changed how schools approached learning differences. She'd been nominated for international awards, until her name was dragged through the mud. Who led the backlash? Edward asked, though he already knew. Alan pointed to one page. The list's long, but your foundation's on it, near the top. Edward closed the folder, the weight of it pressing down like a stone. Does she know? Maybe, but if she does, she's playing a long game. Edward stared at the photo of her smiling beside a classroom full of children. Or maybe she's just doing what I never did, he murmured. Helping because it's right, not because it's profitable. That night, Edward found Naomi in the kitchen, washing dishes quietly. He hesitated, then said, I read about you. She didn't look up. I assumed you would. Why didn't you tell me? What would you have done if I had? She asked. Would you have hired me anyway? He didn't answer. Naomi turned off the faucet, dried her hands, and looked at him. You can't fix what you refuse to see, Mr. Monroe. Not about me. Not about your daughter. Not about yourself. And with that, she left him alone in the echoing silence. In that moment, Edward Monroe, a man who had built empires, crushed competitors, and bought influence with ease, realized he was standing face to face with someone he couldn't buy, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't understand. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to. He just didn't know that the truth Naomi carried was about to destroy the world he'd built, and rebuild it in a way he could never have imagined. The next week passed like a slow unraveling. Naomi still came to work every morning, calm and composed, but something had shifted. She no longer sang when she cleaned. She no longer lingered near the living room where Emma studied. And Edward, he no longer knew how to look her in the eye. He'd spent his life believing he could control any situation with logic and money. But this wasn't business. This was something deeper, a quiet war between guilt and pride. Every night Emma asked about her. "Daddy, why doesn't Miss Naomi help me anymore?" Edward tried to sound casual. "She's busy, sweetheart." "But she says learning should be fun," Emma said, her small voice breaking his heart. With her, it was fun. He didn't know what to say to that. So he said nothing. By Friday, the silence was unbearable. Edward decided to distract himself with work. He called an early board meeting, but halfway through his assistant interrupted. "Sir, you're getting calls from reporters. Dozens of them." He frowned. "About what?" "I don't know yet, but they're all asking the same thing. Something about your foundation's funding practices." His stomach dropped. Get legal on the line. That evening, he found Naomi in the library again. She was dusting the shelves, but he could tell her mind was elsewhere. He stepped inside. "Did you talk to anyone about me?" She looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, did you speak to the press?" "No," she said calmly. "But maybe they finally started looking for the truth themselves." Edward's voice hardened. "You think you can ruin me because I questioned you?" Naomi didn't flinch. "I don't have to ruin you, Mr. Monroe. You already built your empire on broken promises. It was only a matter of time before the cracks showed." He slammed his hand on the desk. "You don't know what you're talking about." Her voice stayed steady, almost sorrowful. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. You funded schools that excluded children who needed help the most. You called it merit-based learning. I called it what it really was: gatekeeping." Edward's pulse thundered. "You don't understand how this world works." "I understand enough to know you're afraid of losing control." That landed like a knife. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi took a slow breath and said quietly, "You're not the villain in my story, Mr. Monroe. You're just proof that even the powerful can be blind." She turned to leave, but Edward stopped her. "What are you going to do?" Naomi looked back. "What I should have done a long time ago." The next morning, the world woke up to headlines that made Edward's stomach twist. Whistleblower professor reemerges. Naomi Clark returns to expose education inequality. There was a photo. Naomi, standing tall behind a podium at the National Education Forum. Her hair tied neatly, her voice captured mid-speech, eyes alive with fire. He turned on the TV, and there she was, speaking live. "My name is Dr. Naomi Clark," she said clearly to a crowded auditorium. "For 2 years I lived under another name. I worked in homes like Mr. Edward Monroe's, seeing firsthand how privilege blinds even the well-meaning." Edward's hand froze on the remote. Naomi continued, her tone calm, strong, impossible to ignore. "The man who employed me runs a foundation that claims to support education, but his donations helped create barriers, not bridges. He silenced voices that challenged his version of success, including mine." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Edward's phone began buzzing uncontrollably. Texts, emails, news alerts, on screen. Naomi spoke again. "I was dismissed, discredited, and forced to start over because I believed every child deserved a chance to learn, not just the ones who could afford it. I became invisible to survive, but I will not stay invisible any longer." The crowd erupted in applause. Edward sank into his chair, heart pounding. He'd been exposed, not just as a hypocrite, but as the very kind of man he'd spent his life pretending not to be. That night, reporters camped outside the gates. Calls poured in from board members and investors, all saying the same thing: damage control. But there was no controlling this. Naomi's speech had gone viral. Clips of her addressing inequality filled the internet. Parents, teachers, and students shared her story. Your daughter Naomi Clark trended for 2 days straight. By the weekend, half his business partners had suspended deals. Edward's empire, built on image and influence, was cracking apart in real time. Sunday morning, he found Emma sitting at the breakfast table, tablet in hand, watching Naomi's speech again. "She's on TV, Daddy," Emma said softly. "She's so smart." Edward sat across from her, the words catching in his throat. "Yes," he whispered. "She is. She said everyone deserves to learn," Emma added. "Even kids who don't have fancy schools." Edward looked at his daughter. Really looked. She had Naomi's light in her eyes now, the kind of confidence no amount of tutoring could buy. And for the first time, he saw the full truth. Naomi hadn't taken anything from him. She'd given his daughter something no money could ever replace: hope. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Edward drove to the old university campus where Naomi's conference had been held. He didn't know what he'd say if he saw her. He only knew he had to try. He waited in the back of the nearly empty auditorium until the last of the journalists had left. When Naomi finally stepped off the stage, she saw him standing there. "Mr. Monroe," she said quietly. "I wondered when you'd show up." He took a step forward, his voice rough. "I didn't come to argue. I just wanted to understand." Naomi studied him for a long moment. Understanding is the first step. What comes after is the real test. He nodded. "Tell me what I can do." Her expression softened, though her eyes stayed guarded. "Start by listening. Not to me. To the people you never saw before. The ones who never had your microphone, your boardroom, or your last name." Edward nodded slowly, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm sorry," Naomi gave a small, tired smile. "Don't be sorry, Mr. Monroe. Be different." As she walked away, he realized she had done something extraordinary. Something that no board member, investor, or therapist had ever done. She'd stripped his world down to the truth. And even though it hurt, it was the first time he'd felt free. 6 months had passed since the day Naomi Clark stood beneath the bright lights and told the world the truth. 6 months since Edward Monroe's empire began to crumble. His company was gone now, sold off in pieces after investors fled. His name, once spoken with respect in boardrooms and charity galas, now appeared in articles with words like scandal, bias, and collapse. But strangely, he didn't feel broken, just lighter. He rented a small apartment overlooking the city, with creaking floors and sunlight that leaked through old windows. Every morning, he took the bus downtown, something he hadn't done since college, and volunteered at a public learning center Naomi had once written about. He taught kids how to code. He learned how to listen, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't the richest man in the room. The center was full of noise and color, walls painted by students, laughter echoing down the halls. One afternoon, as he was packing up laptops, he heard a familiar laugh. High-pitched, joyful, "Daddy." Emma ran into the room, her ponytail bouncing. Behind her stood Naomi, dressed simply but with the same quiet strength he remembered. Edward froze. "You're here," Naomi smiled. "The center's part of my new outreach program. We're expanding into communities across the city." Emma tugged his sleeve. "Miss Naomi's helping me with my reading again." Edward laughed softly, shaking his head. "Of course she is." Naomi's expression softened. "She's a quick learner. She just needed someone to believe in her own way of thinking." He nodded slowly. "So did I." Later that day, when the kids had gone home, Edward and Naomi stood by the windows overlooking the playground. The sun dipped low, turning everything gold. "You were right," he said quietly. "About everything." Naomi shook her head. "It's not about being right. It's about what we do next." He looked at her. Really looked at her. Not as the woman who exposed him, but as the teacher who had changed his daughter's world. I want to help, he said. Not with money, with work. With time. Naomi tilted her head, studying him. You think redemption is something you can build? He gave a small, almost humble smile. No, but maybe it's something you can earn. One honest step at a time. Naomi's eyes softened. Then start walking. Weeks turned into months, and word spread about the center. More families came. Single parents, children who had fallen through the cracks, teachers who wanted to learn Naomi's methods. Edward kept showing up. He fixed computers, carried boxes, helped with repairs. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who once funded exclusive schools now sweeping floors in a public one. But every time he saw Emma helping another kid with homework, every time he heard Naomi's calm voice guiding a class, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. One afternoon, Naomi found him alone in the empty classroom. Erasing the whiteboard, Mr. Monroe, she said softly. You've been coming here every day for 3 months. You don't have to prove anything to me. He set down the marker. I'm not proving anything. I'm learning. Learning what? That real power isn't about being above people. It's about lifting them up. Naomi smiled faintly. You sound like a teacher, he chuckled. Maybe I'm just a good student. A few weeks later, Naomi invited him to a public ceremony at the state university. The hall was filled with educators, students, and press. On stage, a banner read, The Naomi Clark Fellowship for Inclusive Learning. When she took the podium, the crowd fell silent. Education, she began, isn't about who sits at the front of the room. It's about who gets a seat in it at all. When I hid from the world, I thought I'd lost my purpose. But then I met a little girl who reminded me that learning isn't about wealth or status. It's about wonder. She looked out into the crowd, her eyes meeting Edward's for a brief, wordless second. That little girl, Emma Monroe, taught me that every child deserves to feel seen. And her father, she continued, her voice steady, taught me that change is possible, even for those who helped build the walls we must now tear down. A soft murmur rippled through the room. Edward felt tears sting his eyes. The applause began slowly, then grew, louder, warmer, until the entire hall stood in ovation. After the ceremony, they met in the quiet garden behind the building. Naomi leaned against the stone railing, the evening air cool around them. You didn't have to come. I wanted to, he said. You gave me my daughter back. She was always yours, Naomi said gently. You just needed to see her differently. He nodded. And what about you? Are you happy? Naomi looked out over the campus, the fading light catching her eyes. I'm at peace. That's better than happy. They stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of students laughing somewhere in the distance. Then Naomi said softly, You know, Mr. Monroe, forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what can't be undone. He met her gaze. Then I hope someday you'll forgive me. Naomi smiled. A real one this time, gentle and bright. Maybe I already have. As Edward walked back through the garden, he passed a group of children leaving the auditorium, their backpacks full of donated books, their voices full of hope. He thought about who he used to be, the man obsessed with control, perfection, image, and he thought about who he was now, a man rebuilding from the inside out. Naomi had lost everything because she dared to tell the truth. He had lost everything because he refused to hear it. Now, together, they were building something better, something that didn't belong to either of them, but to everyone willing to believe that change was possible. The last thing he saw before leaving the campus was a new mural above the entrance. It showed a child holding a book, sunlight spilling from its pages. Underneath were Naomi's words, painted in bold letters, Knowledge belongs to everyone. Light grows stronger when it's shared. Edward stood there for a long time, smiling through tears. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to face it. not as Edward Munro, billionaire or businessman, but as a man who had finally learned what it meant to see.